Hey there, all you good people. I'm Joe from Joe's Computer Museum. Today we're at a real museum and we're going to talk to the museum director about their really cool computer collection. Warm up the CRT, it's time for another episode. Today we're talking with Jim Gibson, the museum director of the Knox County Historical Museum. Thanks for coming on the show today, Jim. Appreciate it.
Happy to be here, Joe. Been looking forward to talking to you about our computers.
Great. So, Jim, if you will, can you please give the viewers a quick rundown of your job here and a little bit about the museum itself?
Well, I'm the director of the museum. The museum is operated by the Knox County Historical Society. Mm-hmm. We are this year celebrating our 75th year as a historical society. Going to have some big celebrations this fall.
Good.
I have been the director for 18 years now here at the museum.
Wow.
We acquired this building in 1985 or 6. It had been a motorcycle dealership prior to our purchase of the building. The company had gone out of business. Building was available and we bought it primarily because it was what we could afford at the time.
Sure.
Didn't look much like a museum. Looked like a motorcycle dealership, basically. Had solid plate glass windows on the front and had a big showroom up front where they had display of all the motorcycles. But in pretty short order, our original museum directors turned it into a very nice museum. And since I've been here, we've doubled the size of the building in 1998, and then we added another small room, 2,500 square foot room. A few years later, we have 20 acres of land here now. It's a wonderful, wonderful museum. Great building and a great facility. Might mention that Knox County, Ohio, is a small county, partly industrial, partly agricultural. Population has never been more than 60,000, I don't think.
Yeah.
Mount Vernon is the county seat and has never been more than 20,000, I don't believe. So we're a small central Ohio county, and there are many, many county history museums throughout the state, and we're very proud of ours. We have more than 15,000 square feet of display space here at the museum. We're all on one floor, handicapped accessible, and lots of parking space, which is a rare thing in smaller county history museums.
Absolutely. And looking at the collection, you have quite a wide dearth of things from computers and technology, which we're going to talk about today, but also you have steam engines from local industry. You have some of Paul Lynde's stuff. And
we do.
I look forward to asking you some questions about that here in a couple of minutes.
Sure.
But right now, I'm really curious to know about the computer collection you've started. And it's Joe's Computer Museum is my channel name, so that's what we're going to talk about a little bit today. I'm curious, when did you start the computer collection and why?
Well, I've been thinking about the computer exhibit for a long time. History museums tend to feature things that are really, really old. Covered wagon stuff and stories about pioneers that settled the town 200 years ago, and we have plenty of that here as well. But things that are to me recent history are important too, because they won't always be recent. In 50 years, people will look back and say, gee, I wonder what computers were like when personal computers came on the market. And I lived through that time, and I'm basically a pack rat and threw very little away. So I saved all of my early computer stuff, and so I have a great deal of things myself. I have picked up things here and there at yard sales and here and there around, and have added to my personal collection. My wife has been an avowed Apple person all of her life, and I've been a Windows person, and before that a CP/M person. So she has all of the early Apple stuff that she acquired too. We came to Mount Vernon in 1971. I was a school psychologist, and I ran all of the special education programs in the city schools. Was in charge of the speech therapists and the special reading people and all the special education classes in our school system. And after a number of years, I went out on my own and my wife and I opened a private educational tutoring center here in town, which we operated for 35 years or so. And I was toying with the idea of kind of jumping on the computer bandwagon in some way in the late 70s, early 80s, but decided education was really my background, so I thought I would use computers rather than tend towards programming in that direction. Mm-hmm. So we opened our tutoring center, and we began very quickly to use computers there. We bought the video brain that we'll talk about in a little bit. Students loved it. It plugged into a regular TV, had a great mathematics tutoring program on it that I could work with students doing. And used it for quite a few years, and then we began to get into early Radio Shack computers, and Linda had Apple IIs and IIes and Cs, got into Macintoshes later on and so forth. So at one time we were tutoring 40 children a week between the two of us, and we had computer stations at our tutoring facility. Probably had a dozen or 15 computers going, at least available all the time. So so we were interested in more of the applications of early computers rather than the technology side of them.
Okay, that's cool. Well, that explains a quite bit of where a lot of the things came from.
Right.
I presume that, a lot of this acquisition is primarily from your personal collection.
It is, but I've always been watching out for things, and of course, when I bought an Osborne in December of 1982, and there was a Osborne Club in Columbus at the time at one of the technical colleges. They had a monthly meeting of Osborne users, which was great, and really, really a fun group. Probably 150 people came every month. It was wonderful.
Cool.
And everybody that was having little problems could get them solved by somebody who had been down that road before. Mm-hmm. So through that, then I got interested in other kinds of computers. I subscribed to Creative Computing magazine. I had kind of a loose business relationship with them. I wasn't employed by them, but I represented Creative Computing magazine for a time at trade shows. They had a early computer show probably in 81 or 82 in Columbus, and I took care of the Creative Computing booth there, gave out magazines, cool. And they sent me a lot of samples of their software, which I'll show you some of in a little bit. Most of it on cassette at that time. And then I used to read Kilobaud, and I read the 6800 magazine, the Southwest Technical, the magazine that was for users of that kind of system, CPM systems. So we were well into computers long before Windows came along, and I think, but Apple, my wife was intrigued with the whole Apple idea, and so she rode the Apple bandwagon pretty much from the beginning.
Well, that's good to hear. We're a very Apple-friendly channel here on Joe's Computer Museum, yeah. So I appreciate the props to Apple there. How many pieces do you have in the collection right now, if you had to?
Well, I maybe a dozen or 15, something like that. There are a lot more kind of slated, as I mentioned earlier. We have finally wrapped up our tutoring facility, and I've got a lot of mid 80s on Radio Shack models of various kinds, and of course Linda has all her Apple stuff, which is still at our facility, and so we're trying to decide how to sort that out. So we'll probably be adding quite a few more, but we have I try to have as much variety as I can. So I've been showing here maybe a dozen or 15 different models, I suppose.
Yeah, that's cool. Do you think any of the pieces here have a particular interest to Knox County history, or?
Well, of course, the fact that we acquired them and used them in our business. The Timex Sinclair I bought at a yard sale here, so I'm sure it was used by somebody locally. I used to do a regular once a month gig on the local radio station, just talking about what's happening here at the Historical Society, and mentioned several times that I was interested in acquiring early computer stuff, and never really got any response to that. I've been thinking about doing that again since we finally have a real exhibit here that we can point to.
That's good.
But I'm sure there are a lot of people that have machines around. I did have a call. I should correct my earlier statement. I had a call from one person, I think, who heard me mention it on the radio, who said he had some Commodore 64 stuff, and did I want that? He said it's just in a box, big box, and it's all strewn together. And I said, yeah, absolutely. And so 2 days later, I came out, and it was in a box sitting by the front door.
Oh, wow.
No name, no note, no anything. And so I don't even know who he was to recognize the donation. But so the Commodore things came from him. The Amiga behind me is was given to us by a fellow that I got to know who lives in Indianapolis. Doesn't have a local connection, but he has family connections that go way, way back, and he comes to Mount Vernon to do family research occasionally. So that's pretty much it for local.
That's cool. I do remember you mentioned once that some local engineers from one of the local manufacturing plants came in. They all saw the 64 and were gushing over that.
Oh yeah, that was just a few weeks ago, maybe a month ago. We had 16 mechanical engineer employees at the Siemens Corporation here in town. Those folks build large compressors, the kind of machines that go on the offshore drilling rigs and so forth.
Okay.
And they're all, 25 to 40 age range, and so they loved seeing the 64. Probably half of them jumped when they saw it and said, "Oh, I had one of those. I love that. That's what I started out on." And they recognized the Timex as well, and the Apple C. I think a couple of people had Apple Cs too.
That's cool. One thing I did want to mention to the viewers out there is the Amiga over Jim's head here. Amigas like that were used very frequently in the late 80s and early 90s to run the preview guide. One of which we had on our local cable station here in town. This Amiga wasn't used for that, but Amigas like that were specifically used to run that. So I thought that was interesting when I saw the Amiga in here. I'm like, hey, that's got some computing history. Of course, it's an Amiga too, so it's important.
Been reading about each of these models online. The Vintage Computer, and there's a computer museum website. Several good websites for computer history.
A lot of stuff out there.
And a lengthy article about the enormous sales of the Commodore 64s, that they were selling twice as many units as Apple was during their heyday. And it said one of their engineers said during the peak years they were selling 400,000 a month of those, and that's just unheard of. Those kinds of numbers are unimaginable.
As far as I remember, to this day, the Commodore 64 is still the best-selling single unit computer in history ever.
They said it when they introduced it at the Consumer Electronics Show. The Atari people were standing in the Commodore booth with their mouths hanging open and saying, "How can you do that for $595?" And they were stunned at the competition.
Yeah, well, the trick is that Commodore owned all the chip manufacturers. They owned MOS technology. They used a little vertical integration. They were able to get the equipment at cost. Jack Tramiel was able to use that to just kill the competition. So
they sold through department stores and really unusual channels as well. The Video Brain didn't know how to do that apparently, and even though it was an excellent machine, came out in 1979, I think. They just didn't have the marketing channels that came along later, and just couldn't sell the numbers they needed to. But Commodore had that idea, and I remember when the Atom came out. Kmart was selling Atoms. I remember being in a Kmart store at that time. But right at the front entrance, there was a big stack of boxes of Atoms with one open and operating on the top. And that was kind of a risky venture, because suddenly you were selling to the general public that walked into a Kmart, and they didn't really have people in the store that knew salespeople that knew very much about them.
Right.
So it was kind of buying a pig in a poke in those days.
Understood. Of all the pieces in your collection here, what do you think is the rarest piece?
I've been thinking about that a little bit. I think probably the Mac Portable. Might be, simply because it was so expensive and didn't sell very well. So I don't imagine there were too many of them, first of all, that were sold, and then secondly that survived. But it was my wife's personal Mac that she used a lot. She took it when she went to visit her parents. She would take it along It has a built-in trackball. It has a 40 meg hard drive. Cost $7,300 when it was new. Just imagine that in 1989, I think. By 91, they had given up on it, and at that price, when you think what you could have bought for a fourth or a fifth of that in those days.
Oh yeah.
I don't imagine they sold many. She didn't buy it new. She bought it. There was a great used computer store in the south side of Westerville for a number of years. Called CompUsed.
Oh yeah, I remember that.
People,
it's right there off Dempsey and Route 3.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Did you go in there?
I've been in there a couple times.
People would trade in there, buy a new computer, and then they would take it in there on consignment, sell it. He took a piece of the action. We bought a lot of the things we had used from him. He would always, do refurbish if necessary, and they were always in good shape and very, very reasonably priced. And he had a thriving business until computer prices came down so dramatically that you could buy a new one for not much more than a used one would cost. So, but that was a fun store. He had software there for all the different models of computers, and he would repair printers and things like that.
Had a lot of spare parts too. If I remember, he had a lot of spare pulled chips and stuff for repairs.
He did. He had a couple of guys there that did technical work for him that people would walk in with their computer to get it fixed as well. There was a Commodore store. I think it was kind of an Amiga store eventually. That was it was near where the Micro Center is now on Lane Avenue in Columbus.
Oh, okay.
The original Micro Center was on Lane Avenue, or Bethel is where it is now, of course. Lane Avenue in Columbus is where the original Micro Center was, and I spent a lot of time in that store in 78, 79, 90. That was a fun store, and they had an Osborne room in that store, an Osborne room, and they had a big Apple area, and I'll tell you, people were buying Apple IIs, printers, everything to get going, and spending $25 or $26 or $2,700 and wheeling their Apple II out of that store, looking like happy people in the early '80s, and that's when I bought my Osborne there as well, and around Christmas of '82.
Ah, that's cool. Of all of these pieces, you've mentioned quite a few of them: the 64, the Video Brain, the Osborne. Which one is your favorite, and do you have a reason why it's your favorite?
Well, I'd certainly have to say the Osborne's my favorite. That was a major thing. I did a lot of reading before I decided what I was going to buy. Osborne's had been out about a year or so when I was ready to take the plunge. They cost $1,795. That was a lot of money. And, and you could buy several other pretty good machines for that amount or less. Seriously considered an Apple II, but I decided I wanted something that had a lot of software with it, and that was the big deal with the Osborne. Mr. Osborne, Adam Osborne, bundled. He was the first guy to bundle software with a computer that you bought from the store. You brought it home, and you had WordStar, DBase 2.
I remember that.
A SuperCalc type program.
What was the marketing? Is like we were selling you the computer to run the software you bought?
But because software was so expensive, WordStar, the word processing program, cost $600 if you bought it separately, as did DBase 2 and the SuperCalc program. Each of them cost $600 separately. So by buying an $1,800 computer, you got $1,800 worth of software. And while Mr. Osborne said you buy the computer, the software is free, the competitors said you buy the software and then throw the computer in for free. But I love the Osborne. I used it a lot. I was really thrilled with it, and I was operating an antique show, an annual antique show here in town at the time on the side, and I had a 2,500 name mailing list of people who had attended in the past that I wanted to send announcements out to, and I kept those on one floppy disk and hooked them up to my printer, and I could print out the 2,500 labels in pretty short order. I always did sit with it while it printed on the dot matrix printer because occasionally it would jam and you'd have 1,000 names on one label. So you did have to kind of keep an eye on it.
The old
But-
mechanical cogwheel stuff.
But I truly love the Osborne, and as a matter of fact, I continued to use it long after other more modern machines came along. I kept that mailing list operating on it, and I haven't fired up the Osborne for a while, but I think if I did, it would probably still run just fine.
Probably would. That's the thing about these old 8-bit computers. They are built like tanks. If you take care of them, they'll take care of you.
They call them luggables instead of portables because the Osborne weighed about 25 or 6 pounds.
Yeah.
The K-Pro, which came along later, we have a K-Pro here that's been donated to the museum. K-Pro was in considerable part responsible for the demise of Osborne.
Yeah.
They had a bigger screen. It was a little less expensive, a couple of $100 less expensive. And of course, Mr. Osborne made the famous error of announcing a serious upgrade to his Osborne
remember that, yeah.
before he had it ready to ship. And on a Friday afternoon, he called a press conference and announced this huge improvement to the Osborne. And the following Monday, his cash flow just dried up because everybody decided to wait till the new machine was ready, and it wasn't ready. And it was ready in maybe 3 or 4 months, but he had pretty much zero sales until the new machine was ready to ship, and by that time he was in deep trouble financially.
Oh, yeah. Now, I do have a question about the layout of the pieces you have here. They're set up in mostly a standard museum display behind glass or set up for presentation, and that's awesome. It allows people to take a look at it. But I do have a question. Do you have a plan to put one or a different one maybe in rotation on an active or live display to allow people from time to time, or maybe upon request, to come and play with the computer and get to see what it was like to do computing back in the days?
I do. I've been kind of tiptoeing along with this concept because I set up we have a wonderful collection of typewriters, very early typewriters, some from the 1890s here as well, and I made a display of those at the same time I added the computer display. And I wanted to do the same thing, wanted to have a typewriter out for especially young people to try out. And I've had some school groups here lately. I have an IBM Electric that is going to be the one that they get to tinker with, but I don't have it hooked up and ready for them to use quite yet. But I did want to see how they reacted to it, and I must say I was a little disappointed because most of the time when school groups come to the museum, they're very well behaved, and I have no problem with that, but toward the end they get a little bit of free time to walk around and look at things more, and they were banging away on the typewriter in a way that I was not happy with. They were asking me why it wasn't typing and hitting it harder to make it try to make it type. They were kind of unsupervised at that time. There was 2 school groups I had here in the past month that I had 70 third graders at the same time. So it's pretty hard to keep them all in one place. But so that gave me a little lesson, made me think a little more about the computers. The video brain, since it's mine, and since it operates through a regular TV, and since the cartridge type programs are pretty much self-running, they're multiple choice. I think math questions, just simple addition, subtraction, multiplication, division questions. That they just punch a letter, just press a letter on the keyboard to respond. And I am hoping that will be, I think that'll be a workable system for now. At least I'm going to try it. I have 2 video brains, by the way. The first one I think we paid $500 or $600 for when it first came out, and then when the company was beginning to head down the road of Chapter 11, a few years later, we were able to buy another one, I think, for maybe $100. And it had more software with it than our original one did. So, so I do have 2, and I'll take the one that is less new and let them tinker with that a little bit, see how that works. And I'm certainly not opposed to having the Amiga or some of these others up and running. The Osborne I'd be glad to have running, but it's a little disheartening to see. And I visit schools fairly often, and I see students not being very respectful of computers.
Oh, yeah.
They seem to think of them as disposable items that, they don't shut them down, they don't close things down properly, and they just throw the switch when it's time to shut them off in the middle of whatever they're doing. And I don't see teachers insisting that they do it
Sure.
better a lot of times. So I'm trying to take a lesson from that.
Well, you know, the kids today, they've grown up with these $200 Walmart specials, so
Right.
to speak, that, oh, it doesn't matter if I break it.
Well,
They don't have the respect, you know, of the old machines where you had to treat the machine properly for it to treat you properly.
Right.
So-
Although, you know, I'm old school enough to think it doesn't matter if it costs, you know, $7. It's something that you want to be there and running tomorrow just the same as it is today. And if you get the idea that if I bang on it with my fists, somebody will bring me a shiny new one tomorrow, that's a sign that I'm getting older, I guess.
I understand. Now, the computer section here is situated near some other data processing items. I see some adding machines and some typewriters. Tell me a little bit about the rest
The
of that.
typewriters are wonderful. We've had a collection of typewriters here for a number of years and have not had them out on proper display until just recently. We didn't really have space for them, but one of our former board members had a collection that had been her father's, I believe, early on, and there's a Blickensderfer number 5 typewriter that was made in 1892 that
Oh,
has
wow.
changeable type ball on it, very much like IBM's of the Selectrics. Has an alternate typeface that you can put on, has a keyboard layout that's not the QWERTY system. It preceded QWERTY. Mr. Blickensderfer decided that his system was better than QWERTY and insisted on using it even though everybody else used the QWERTY system. And under duress, he manufactured a QWERTY model, but had a document packed with it when it sold that the buyer had to sign saying they understood that it had a different keyboard layout which was not as good as his original layout, and they were buying the machine knowing that it was a less effective system. I always thought that was a great story, but several other really nice typewriters. An Oliver that has the keys come down from the side like this instead of facing
Oh,
you.
interesting.
The big pitch with that was that you could see what you were typing. It was really the first machine that you could actually visually look at what you were typing while you were typing. The keys, you know, were pretty much out of the way. Several others. We have a really nice Smith before it was Smith Corona. That is for left-handed secretaries. Probably, you talk about rare items, it's probably a very, very rare typewriter. Was made just especially for corporate secretaries who were left-handed, and has the carriage return on the right instead of the left, as we're more used to.
Wow.
So splendid typewriter collection. We don't have a huge number. We have maybe a dozen. Have a few more that we don't have on display, but kind of representative ones out. The office machines that we have here are nifty. We have a Burroughs adding machine that's very early, has the glass enclosed case. I've read that it has 2,000 moving parts in it. It was
Wow.
the first machine that Mr. Burroughs, among the first machines that Mr. Burroughs produced. After sales were lagging in the beginning, he was able to find out from potential customers that the customers didn't believe that the adding machine could do what it was doing in the demonstrations by the salespeople. The customers prior to that were doing their bookkeeping with quill pens sitting on high stools in accounting offices, and this was such a radical move forward. They just simply didn't believe the machine could do that, and so he devised the glass case for it so that the users could see what it was doing when the parts were moving inside. Pretty ingenious idea, and as a result, he dominated the market. Burroughs adding machines led the field for a long, long time. We have a Wang programmable calculator that was used here in the company, the original company here in Mount Vernon that made steam engines and oil gas transmission compressors.
Was it
Cooper
Cooper?
Company here was originally C&G Cooper, became Cooper Bessemer later on. This is a 1970s era Wang 500 programmable calculator with a cassette program device built into it. And several other little slide rules. Of course, we have lots of slide rules from engineers that have worked at Cooper's and other industry here locally too.
For the users at home, the Wang that he's talking about is the size of a small, gosh, like it's I can't even use the word small to describe it. It's gigantic. The Apple IIc he has in the collection is about a quarter of the size and has about 400 times the processing power, if that gives you any idea of what things used to be like. I also see over here you have a fairly extensive phone collection that includes an old switchboard, and like many geeks, I'm not just a computer geek, I'm an old phone geek.
Oh, yeah.
Do you have any history about that switchboard?
The switchboard was used here in Mount Vernon. It dates from about 1909, I believe.
Oh, wow.
Maybe a little earlier than that even. We have photographs of telephone operators at the phone office here in town, as well as at the smaller communities within our county. A couple of the pictures of the switchboards in very small communities here are, we're in the operators' houses. You know, they didn't have a separate telephone office in the smaller towns. They would just put the switchboard in the operator's house. And then we have an outstanding collection of telephones. There was a gentleman named George Tanner who was started out in the 1930s with the phone company here as a guy that climbed telephone poles and did repair of lines. Eventually became one of the top people in the phone system here. He was interested in telephone history himself, so each time the telephone technology advanced, he would keep examples of the older technology, basically. That's what I've done with computers here. And they had a small museum in the basement of their home for a number of years here in Mount Vernon after he retired, and school children would go through their home and learn about telephone history. And when he got up in years, eventually passed away, his wife told us she wanted us to have the collection. It's a sizable collection. We have several hundred phones actually from his collection. We've had some others, the more modern. We have early cell phones or early portable phones as well that came along after he died. But wonderful wall crank phones. We have a Ericsson metal wall phone that was used probably more likely in a hotel than a private home, and several wall phones from the 1880s and 90s, and lots of candlestick phones, some with dials and some before dials. As well as the big switchboard, of course. It's enormous and would allow maybe 100 people to be using the telephone at the same time in Mount Vernon if all of the connections were in use at the same time. Wow. Yeah, it's a great collection. The Mr. Tanner's widow could have sold the collection. There are several private telephone museums in the country, and she was approached by more than one of them to sell the collection, but she wanted it to stay here in Knox County where they were from.
That's good to hear.
Yeah.
We definitely appreciate that.
Yeah.
Now, back to the museum itself, I know that Paul Lynde's memorabilia is a big draw here because, you know, Paul Lynde was the famous actor, comedian, was a Knox County, Mount Vernon native. And especially his yellow Ford Thunderbird, which is right here in the collection, is a personal favorite of mine, because I'm also a kind of a car guy too. Is there any particular item in the museum that you would call your favorite, and why?
Well, the Paul Lynde collection is also a splendid collection. Paul was born here in the late 1920s, went through grade school and high school here, graduated from high school in 1944. There are still 25 or 30 people here in town that were in his graduating class of 1944. It's hard to imagine, isn't it? They're getting up in their early 90s now. But they knew Paul well. All of them knew Paul well and went to school with him from the time they were in first grade through high school. And he would come back to reunions on a pretty regular basis in the 1960s and 70s. The Yellow Thunderbird, I'm not quite clear about its origins. I know that he bought it either here or in Hollywood, but he brought it here to have a car when he came back to Mount Vernon, to have a car to drive around here, and he left it with his sister who lived here in town for much of the time. He didn't drive it back and forth to California. They did. They drove it to California a couple of times to see him. But he would come back for his reunions, and of course he was the hometown movie star guy, so he would come back for when Bye Bye Birdie premiered. They had a big event here in Mount Vernon for him. They had Paul Lynde Day. set aside for that. He's been a generous person and supporting the high school and high school arts programs and the theater and so forth. He was part of the Kenley Players. That was a really popular summer theater group throughout Ohio. They had theaters in Warren, Ohio, up in the northeastern part of the state, in Dayton and Columbus and one other place, and they would have summer theater, and very often would have Paul in a play in the summertime, and he would always mention Mount Vernon. He would kind of alter his lines when he would be in one of the Kenley productions in the summertime. He would change it. If he had a line where he mentioned Paris or London, he would mention Mount Vernon maybe instead. Popular guy, and he would eat downtown in restaurants just like regular people, and enjoyed visiting with local people. So if you look at our website, our museum website, which I should plug, Knox History, www.knoxhistory.org, Knox History, one word, org. The Yellow Thunderbird is on the homepage of our website, along with lots and lots of other local history that are part of the drop-down menus on the homepage. So hope the people will take a look at that. I'll be adding a section on our computers and our typewriters and so forth soon. I haven't done that yet, but we do have an excellent website. We went many years with a not so excellent website, and I'm happy to have that the way I want it now.
I have checked that website out. I can attest it's really well done. So props to Jim and his
Thank
guys.
you. I wrote most of the content, and we wanted to have a little bit about all of the topics that we touch on. Johnny Appleseed, for example, was a guy who lived in Mount Vernon, Knox County in the early 1800s. He was one of the first settlers here. Spent a lot of time in Knox County in Mount Vernon area, probably close to 25 years. He called this area his home. He didn't really have a house much of anywhere. Just traveled around, planted apple orchards here and there, visited with people. He was a real religious guy, would share religious publications with early pioneer families. But his calling in life, he really felt his mission in life was to plant apple trees and apple orchards ahead of pioneers that were moving into Ohio and further west during the first half of the 1800s. And so he spent a good deal of time here in Mount Vernon, and he's one of our early famous people. And of course, Paul Lynde is our more recent famous person, and then Dan Emmett is kind of in between. Dan Emmett's the guy that wrote Old Dan Tucker and Turkey in the Straw, and the most famous song, of course, is Dixie, that became a really major hit for many years. And Dan was born here in Mount Vernon in 1815, died in 1904, came back to Mount Vernon as an older guy in the 1880s and lived out the rest of his life here too. So we have quite a bit of memorabilia on him.
Cool. Well, I was going to plug your website, but you already did it, but I'll do it again. It's knoxhistory.org. It's a really nice site. It gives you a great cross-section of everything they have here. I'll put a link down in the description of that for everybody at home if they want to check that out.
Great.
And Jim, anything else you wanted to talk about today?
Yeah, let me see. I made a couple of notes here. I should mention there's other industry here in Mount Vernon too. And when the school children, all the third graders in our community come through the museum, school by school in May each year, they study a local history unit in third grade in social studies, and after they
remember doing that myself back in the 80s.
After they finish the unit, they come visit the museum and hopefully see things here that they read about or studied about. And as the years go by, I am pleasantly pleased that each year they seem to know more and more. You know, they used to just ask about Dan Emmett and all the really obvious famous people, but now they ask me about more obscure people that were here, bankers and lawyers and people that they've read about in their history. But there was and part of what they study in school in third grade is how things change over time. How are things different now than they were a long time ago? So the computer exhibit fits very nicely with that. So that they can tell their moms and dads when they go home that they saw computers from the 1980s. Some of those would be ones maybe that their parents used or even their grandparents used 35 or 40 years ago. So, but we, in addition to the compressor and steam engine industry and that I talked about earlier, there was a glass industry here for a number of years as well. It's pretty much gone now, but there were two companies, one that made plate glass, Pittsburgh Plate Glass Corporation, made windows, and then there was a local company that made milk bottles that was here for many, many years, manufactured milk bottles for dairies all over the United States, and we have probably 150 or so examples of their milk bottle production from different dairies all over the country, and some good examples of some of the plate glass that the other company made as well. So just a lot of variety here, lots of interesting things on military history and religious history. We're fortunate, as I say, to have a big enough museum that we can have sections that highlight lots of different topics of what it was like to live in Mount Vernon and Knox County a long time ago. So as I can only say that we are an unusual museum for a county our size. I visit lots of other museums throughout Ohio. Most museums happen to start out in a house of some kind. Somebody donated a house, or somebody bought a house for the historical group, and that became their museum. And so the whole future of that historical society is determined by the facility they have to show their exhibits. And house museums are wonderful, but they have steps and they have small rooms and they have limited parking and lots of negatives. We're fortunate in having a building that's perfectly well suited to a museum, and as I say, we've added on twice. We have 20 acres here, and so should the need arise, we've had great support from the community to in short order raise the money necessary to add on to the museum. So hope people will come to visit or look at our website. We are open, I should mention that too, for people in Ohio at least. We are open from March through Thanksgiving each year. We close in December, January, and February for various reasons, mostly weather related. And but we are open March through Thanksgiving, and then we are open Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and Sundays from 2 until 4. Cool. And Wednesday evenings from 6 until 8. And we have monthly programs here. 7 or 8 months out of the year we have speakers and interesting. You have a list
of all of that on the website as well.
Right.
I saw the events calendar.
You bet. We had this week or two ago, we had the vice president of the White Castle Corporation came there in their 95th year.
Is he a Mount Vernon native?
No, but he lives here. I think maybe his wife's family is from Central Ohio. His wife's grandfather, I believe, started the White Castle Corporation in 1921, so they're in their 95th year. And he did an outstanding job. He's the PR guy and corporate philanthropy person for the White Castle Corporation, and travels all over the country. He's often on Neil Cavuto's business shows and a lot of Fox and CBS and NBC network business programs as a consultant. He lives here in town. His kids go to one of the schools here, and we've known him for a number of years. And a good guy, and he brought coupons for sliders. Everybody got a coupon for 3 sliders for attending the meeting, and we had 50 or 60 people at that meeting.
Hey, so you bring free food, people show up, right?
So I hope people will come to visit. We have an excellent museum and good people that help us here, and costs $3 to enter the museum. Kids 12 and under are free, and can't beat that these days. And
nope.
And you can spend the whole, if you come right when we open at 2 o'clock on Thursday through Sunday, you can stay the 2 hours and enjoy yourself.
Excellent. Well, you do have a beautiful museum here, and I envy your job and your position, being able to
Thank you.
To take care of this wonderful collection. It's very large. Yeah, well, thanks for allowing me to interview, and thanks for coming on the show. I really appreciate your input and your insights. Again, check out their website, knoxhistory.org, and I'll leave a link for you in the description. Again, thanks, Jim.
All right, and did we have a little closing?
Yes, we do have a closing. Jim's going to help me out with my closing today. That's all for today's episode, everyone. I really hope you enjoyed it. And if you did, make sure you hit the like button or subscribe. And remember,
8 bits is all you need.
See you again next time, folks. This is Page Editor. It's a text editor written in applesauce by Dr. Bruce Howard. It was originally published in the February 1985 edition of Nimble Magazine. By any standard, page editor is very simple, but for an underprivileged kid toying around with his most prized possession, an Apple IIe that had seen better days, it was like management for the machine to allow you to see those graphics in, you know, all of their 4096 color glory. That's great. But the downside to that is that these things are 30 years old now, and CRT monitors, as we all know, do not age well. The flybacks die, capacitors fail.
All right, fire
All right,
away.
ready to go?
So I'm saying 8 bits is all you need.
8
is
bits,
my
yep.
punchline.
Yeah, 8 bits are all you need if you want to do it the right
And
way.
by the way, so what required 8 bits in the beginning?
8 bits is the basically the processing size of specific individual units of data.
So that's a byte?
Yeah, 8 bits is a byte. And the bits defined a word, effectively, is the amount of data that the processor could handle in a single instruction. Yep. So the
Okay.
newer computers are 64, so it can deal with really big numbers. And
Yeah.